In today's lesson, we will be understanding characteristics of a good psychological test. The main objective in this lesson are understanding what psychological testing is, characteristics of a good psychological test, the concept of standardization, reliability and validity, understanding psychological testing. The first and most general meaning of the term test listed in the dictionary is a critical examination, observation or evaluation. Its closest synonym is trial. The word critical in turn is defined as relating to or a turning point or especially important juncture. Psychological tests are often used to evaluate individuals at some turning point or significant juncture in their lives. Yet, in the eyes of many people, tests seem to be trials on which too much depends and about which they know all too little. Thousands of instruments can accurately be called psychological tests. Many more usurp the label either explicitly or by suggestion. The first objective of this lesson is to understand the term psychological testing aptly. Therefore, we start with defining features that make psychological tests of all types valid. These features not only define psychological tests, but also differentiate them from other kinds of instruments. What is a psychological test? A psychological test is a systematic procedure for obtaining samples of behavior relevant to cognitive or affective functioning and for scoring and evaluating those samples according to standards. A clear understanding of each of the main terms in this definition is important to understand all future discussion of tests. Rapid reference explains the meaning and logic of all the elements in the definition of a psychological test. Unless every condition mentioned in the definition is met, the procedure in question cannot accurately be called a psychological test. Basic elements of the definition of psychological tests. What is the defining element? The defining element for a psychological test are systematic procedures. They are categorized by planning, uniformity and thoroughness. These tests must be demonstratively objective and fair to be used. Psychological tests are samples of behavior. They are small subsets of a much larger whole. The sampling behavior is efficient because the time available is usually limited. The behaviors sampled by tests are relevant to cognitive or affective functioning or both. How do we understand this? The samples are selected for their empirical or practical psychological significance and they are also considered to be tools. Test results are evaluated and scores. Some numerical or category system is applied to test results and there should be no question about what results of tests are. To evaluate test results, it is necessary to have standards based on empirical data. There has to be a way of applying a common yardstick or criterion to test results, and these standards used to evaluate test results lend the only meaning those results have. Psychological tests are often described as standardized for two reasons, both of which address the need for objectivity in testing process. The first has to do with uniformity of procedure in all important aspects of the administration, scoring and interpretation of tests. Naturally, the time and place when a test is administered as well as the circumstances under which it is administered and the examiner who administers it affect test results. However, the purpose of standardizing test procedures is to make all the variables that are under the control of the examiner as uniform as possible, so that everyone who takes the test will be taking it in the same way. Strictly speaking, the term test should be used only for those procedures in which test takers' responses are evaluated based on their correctness or quality. Such instruments always involve the appraisal of some aspect of a person's cognitive functioning, knowledge, skill, or abilities. On the other hand, instruments whose responses are neither evaluated nor scored as right or wrong or pass-fail are called inventories, questionnaires, surveys, checklists, schedules, or projective techniques, and are usually grouped under the heading of personality tests. These are tools designed to draw information about a person's motivations, preferences, attitudes, interests, opinions, emotional makeup, and characteristic reactions to people, situations, and other stimuli. Other terms used in connection with tests and test titles. These terms that are used sometimes loosely in connection with tests have their own importance. One of these is the word scale, which can refer to a whole test made up of several parts, for example, the 𝗪𝗏𝗪 intelligence scale, to a subset or set of items within a test that measures a distinct and specific characteristic, for example, the depression scale of the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory or MMPI. Next, a collection of tests that share some common characteristic, for example, the verbal scale of the Wechsler's intelligence tests. Next, a separate instrument or tool made up of items designed to evaluate a single characteristic, for example, the internal-external locus of control scale by Rotter 1966, or the numerical system used to rate or to report value on some measured dimension, for example, a scale ranging from 1 to 5 with 1 meaning strongly disagree and 5 strongly agree. Thus, when used in reference to psychological tests, the term scale has become vague and lacking in precision. However, in the field of psychological measurement, also known as psychometrics, scale has a more precise meaning. It refers to a group of items that pertain to a single variable and are arranged in order of difficulty or intensity. The process of arriving at the sequencing of the items is called scaling. Battery. Battery is another term often used in test titles. A battery is a group of several tests or subtests that are administered at one time to one person. When several tests are packaged together by a publisher to be used for a specific purpose, the word battery usually appears in the title, and the entire group of tests is viewed as a single whole instrument or tool. For example, Halstead-Retan neuropsychological battery, where many cognitive functions need to be evaluated by means of separate tests in order to detect possible brain impairment. The term battery is also used to label any group of individual tests specifically selected by a psychologist for use with a given client in an effort to answer a particular specific question, usually answering the course of action required to be administered by the psychologist. Let's not forget, the word test has multiple meanings. The term psychological test has a very specific meaning. In this lesson, test will be used to refer all instruments that fit the definition of psychological test, and tests designed to sample skills, knowledge, or any other cognitive function will be referred to as ability tests, and all others will be labeled as personality tests. Psychological tests as tools. The most basic fact about psychological tests is that they are tools. This means that they are always a means to an end and never an end in themselves. Like other tools, psychological tests can be very helpful, even irreplaceable when used properly and skillfully. However, tests can also be misused in ways that may limit their usefulness and at times even result in harmful consequences. Psychological tests are tools designed to help understand about individuals or groups. When tests are used appropriately and skillfully, they can be key components in the practice and science of psychology. History of psychological testing. Even though psychological tests can be used to explore and investigate a wide range of psychological variables, their most basic and typical use is as tools in making decisions about people. It is not coincidence that psychological tests as we know them today came into being in the early part of the 20th century. Prior to the rise of urban industrial democratic societies, there was little need for most people to make decisions about others outside of these in their immediate families or close circle of friends. Psychological testing today is because of the need felt by researchers to understand 1. How to select the best possible people for a job, 2. How to determine that students have acquired the knowledge or expertise their teachers try to instill in them. In the 13th century, university degrees came to be used as a means of certifying eligibility to teach. Formal oral examinations were devised to give candidates a degree which serves as an opportunity to demonstrate their competence. Little by little, the use of examinations spread to the secondary level of education, and as paper became cheaper and more available, written examinations replaced the oral exams in most educational settings. 3. The fundamental human question that can be and has been addressed by means of psychological testing is the problem of differentiating the normal from the abnormal within the intellectual, emotional and behavioral arenas. Many researchers have provided sufficient evidence to support the cause of psychological testing in multiple areas of our everyday life. The current uses of psychological tests. Present day testing is on the whole more methodologically sophisticated and better informed than at any time in the past. The current use of tests, which take place in a wide variety of contexts, may be classified into 3 categories: A. Decision making, B. Psychological research, and C. Self-understanding and personal development. Decision making. The primary use of psychological tests is a decision making tool. This particular application of testing always involves value judgment on the part of one or more decision makers who need to determine the basis upon which to select, place, classify, diagnose or otherwise deal with individuals, groups, organizations or programs. Naturally, this use of testing is often troubled with controversy, since it often results in consequences that are unfavorable for one or more parties. In many situations in which tests are used to make decisions and people disagree with the decisions made, the use of test itself is attacked regardless of whether or not it was appropriate. It is important to remember that when tests are used for making significant decisions about individuals or programs, testing should be merely a part of a thorough and well-planned decision-making strategy. We should consider the particular context in which the decisions are made, the limitations of the tests, and other sources of data in addition to tests than completely relying on a test alone. For psychological research, tests are often used in research in the fields of differential, developmental, abnormal, educational, social and vocational psychology and many other areas. They provide a well-recognized method of studying the nature, development and interrelationships of cognitive, affective and behavioral traits. In fact, although a number of tests that originated in the course of psychological investigations have become commercially available, because the use of tests in research is much less continuous than their use in decision making about individuals, groups, organizations or programs. Self-understanding and personal development. Most humanistic psychologists and counselors have traditionally perceived the field of testing, often justifiably, as overemphasizing the labeling and categorization of individuals in terms of rigid numerical criteria. Starting in the 1970s, a few of them, notably Constance Fisher, began to use tests and other assessment tools in an individualized manner, consonant with humanistic and existential phenomenological principles. This practice, which views testing as a way to provide clients with information to promote self-understanding and positive growth, has evolved into the therapeutic models of assessment espoused by Finn Songer in 1997. Obviously, the most pertinent application of this model is in counseling and psychotherapeutic settings, in which the client is the main and only user of test results. Psychological assessment versus psychological testing. Psychological assessment is a flexible, not standardized process aimed at reaching a strong opinion concerning one or more psychological issues or questions through the collection, evaluation and analysis of data appropriate to the purpose at hand. The use of tests for making decisions about a person, a group or a program should always take place within the context of psychological assessment. This process can occur in healthcare, counseling or forensic settings, as well as in educational and employment settings. Don't forget, tests and assessments are not synonymous. Tests are among the tools used in the process of assessment. This table shows difference between psychological testing and psychological assessment. Based on the degree of complexity, psychological testing is simpler. It involves one uniform procedure and is frequently unidimensional, whereas psychological assessment is more complex and each assessment involves various procedures and other dimensions. Based on duration, psychological testing is shorter, lasting for a few minutes to a few hours, whereas psychological assessment is longer, lasts from a few hours to a few days or more. Based on the sources of data, one person takes the tests when it comes to psychological testing, whereas when it comes to psychological assessment, often collateral sources such as relatives or teachers are used in addition to the subject of the assessment. Psychological testing focuses on how one person or group compares with others. It is nomothetic in its focus, whereas psychological assessment, the uniqueness of a given individual, group or situation is the focus. Qualifications for use. Psychological testing uses the knowledge of tests and testing procedures, whereas assessment uses the knowledge of testing and other assessment methods as well as of the area assessed, for example, psychiatric disorders, job requirements, etc. The procedural basis in psychological testing includes objectivity, required qualification, and this is very critical. Psychological assessments, subjectivity in the form of clinical judgment, required qualification is rarely possible. Based on cost, psychological testing is inexpensive, especially when testing is done in groups. Psychological assessment, on the other hand, is very expensive, requires intensive use of highly qualified professionals. The purpose of psychological testing is to obtain data for use in making decisions, whereas the purpose of psychological assessment is in arriving at a decision concerning the referral question or problem. Psychological testing is highly structured and psychological assessment entails both structured and unstructured aspects. Concerning evaluation of results, testing is relatively simple investigation of reliability and validity based on group results, whereas assessment is very difficult due to variability of methods, assessors, nature of presenting questions, etc. Now that we have understood what is a psychological test and psychological assessment, let us further understand what makes a psychological test a good test. Properties of a good psychological test. Let us understand each of these properties. validity, reliability, and standardization. Validity. A psychological test is said to be valid if it measures what it is intended to measure. An intelligence test, for example, is valid to the extent that it does measure intelligence and not simply some other variable such as knowledge. A number of ways to assess the validity of a test have been developed. Here, I will describe a few of them. 1. Concurrent validity. Results of the test agree with those of another test of accepted validity as a measure of that characteristic. A newly developed test of intelligence would be considered to have concurrent validity if it gave the same IQ values within the measurement error as an established intelligence test. Next, predictive validity. Predictions based on the results agree with what one would expect if the test is a valid measure of the characteristic. A newly developed test of intelligence would be considered to have predictive validity if those who score high on the test tend to do very well in academic settings or other areas thought to require high intelligence, while those who score low on the test do poorly in those areas. Next, face validity. Examination of the test reveals that the test appears to measure what it is intended to measure. For example, a test of mathematical aptitude contains mathematical and logical problems to solve. Face validity is a relatively poor index of the validity of the test as gauged by other methods. A test may have low face validity and yet prove to have good predictive validity. Reliability. A psychological test is reliable to the extent that it produces similar results when the individual is repeatedly tested under the same conditions. There are two main methods used to assess reliability, and these are described below. Test-retest reliability. The same individuals are given the test twice, separated by some interval of time. The Pearson-R correlation is then computed on the pairs of scores across individuals. A test is said to have high test-retest reliability if the correlation is 0.95 or better, where 1.0 equals perfect reliability. Test-retest reliability is usually for tests of characteristics that change only slowly over time, such as intelligence. Split-half reliability. Individuals take the tests and then the items are divided into two equivalent halves, which are then separately scored. The pairs of scores for each test are then correlated as in the test-retest method. The split-half method has the advantage that no time elapses between administrations, so the characteristics being measured cannot change. Standardization. In tests of physical characteristics such as weight, it is possible to establish the accuracy of the measurement by comparing measurements against a set known of standards. Standard samples for many variables are available from the National Bureau of Standards. For psychological characteristics, there are no standard samples that one can purchase and use to evaluate the accuracy of the test. For example, you cannot rent a person known to have an IQ of exactly 100. Thus, to standardize psychological tests, a different method is needed. What is actually done is to administer the test to a large sample of individuals from the population for which the test is intended, and then compute certain group statistics, usually the mean and standard deviation. These provide the average value across individuals and the amount of variability, and are used to determine a formula for converting raw scores to standard scores. Summary of the lesson. Psychological tests are often used to evaluate individuals at some turning point or significant juncture in their lives. Yet, in the eyes of many people, tests seem to be trials on which too much depends and about which they know all too little. Psychologists interested in assessing individuals must be able to define the most meaningful ways of discriminating between one person's personality and another's. To do this, they use psychological tests, standard measures devised to assess behavior objectively. With the result of such tests, psychologists can help people better understand themselves and make their decisions about their lives. Researchers interested in the cause and consequences of behavior or personality also employ psychological tests.